This is Classic FM.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
And being my first guest on my new Cultural Highlights show. Yeah. I'm delighted to have you here.
That's your guinea pig.
It is. And I wanted to ask you about your curating role. You're curating a festival which is celebrating probably the outstanding 19th century opera composers Wagner and Verdi.
Yes.
Could you explain to me exactly what the job entails?
Well, it's the bicentennial year of both composers. They both happened to be born in 1813, and it seemed natural to the Opera House to try and celebrate it somehow. It's also true that Benjamin Britten was born 100 years ago, but Verdi and Wagner represent two utterly different ways of going about the business of entertaining musically on the stage with drama, if one wants to put it that way. Verdi is a supreme entertainer, a melodist, a magnificent entertainer, as I say, who, for a very long period, over a very long time, wrote a series of operas, some of them quite light, frothy, if you will. You know, La Traviata is, of course, it has a sad tubercular death, as most operas should, but its opening drinking song and its bounciness and so on are very typical of his manner. He wrote also some fabulously serious operas. Otello is a remarkable drama opera, and he saved his best to last in many ways, Falstaff, which is really quite, I think, his masterpiece. He was very varied. He wrote also his famous Requiem, the Dies Irae, of which most people are familiar. Wagner, on the other hand, was a really cussed, difficult and extraordinary man to try and explain. He was a kind of intellectual, in as much as he, and it's a matter of fact, he inspired and really set on his path the young Nietzsche, who worshipped him, absolutely worshipped him. Now, no one would deny that Nietzsche was an intellectual. He's one of the most famous philosophers of the 19th century. He called, Wagner the greatest genius that ever lived. He then turned on him and
yes, they fell out, didn't they?
They fell out
yes.
Hugely.
Yeah.
And in the end, Nietzsche ended in an insane asylum. Wagner was interested in all the arts. Basically, there's this famous phrase, the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. He believed that not since the Greeks had the arts all been unified. The Greek theatre was dance, masque, poetry, singing, acting. It was everything, all in one public sort of demonstration, and it was for the people. It was not for an elite. And he started life as pretty much a red revolutionary. He worked with the man whose name is synonymous with anarchy, Mikhail Bakunin, on trying to free Dresden of its sovereignty, of its sovereign. There was no Germany at the time, of course. He was born in Leipzig, but soon moved to Dresden. And he was on the run then for years and years and years with a price on his head as a Red. It's odd because people now, of course, think of him in terms of his connection with Hitler, and because of his anti-Semitism, and they're very dark things people think about Wagner. And even as early as being on the run, he was writing, "One day I will build a theatre on the banks of the Rhine, and people from all over the world will come and listen to my music." And that was 40 or 45 years before he did actually build a theatre. Not on the banks of the Rhine, it was on the banks of the Red Mine, which is a tributary of the mine that does go into the Rhine. So his famous Bayreuth Theatre could be said to have fulfilled his prediction. But along the way, he absolutely transformed music, which is what you can't say about Verdi. Verdi didn't really influence anybody. He was probably a slight influence on Puccini, perhaps. It was, let's say, a vulgar version, utterly lovable, but vulgar version of Verdi. He laid down certain rules on modern art and how it should be in terms of music, and one was that people shouldn't sing over each other. In other words, you immediately get rid of the duet, the trio, the quartet, etc., etc. The lines flow one after the other as if in a play. It's a story. He dispensed with the word opera and called them music dramas. And the words were as important as the music. So no singing over each other, characters developing as in a play by Shakespeare or any other playwright, and the music taking on a very new role, that as a kind of commentator. And he developed this theory of what is known as the Light Motif. So for almost every object of any importance or any idea of any importance in, for example, his major work, The Ring of the Nibelung, there is a leitmotif, you might call it a theme, a particular tune. There's a tune for the sword, Notung. There's a tune for Siegfried. There's a tune for the renunciation of love, for curse, for fate, for Wotan's spear. And anyone who loves Wagner will know each one of these leitmotifs instantly. And of course, they can be used ironically, because you can suddenly hear them where you think they don't belong. So he creates a whole nuanced world in which suddenly you are adding an entirely new dimension to what opera can offer.
Now, I have a confession to make, because when I was a student, I found the prospect of sitting through, say, 5 hours of a Wagner opera rather daunting. And I wonder how you would try to persuade my student self, because I came to Wagner quite late and I love it now. But how would you persuade my student self to give it a go?
I would say the one advantage I had was that I grew up in an age of the big vinyl box set. And with the big vinyl box set, which you could borrow from a library, came a big, and it was, as big as an album piece, what do you call it? Not a brochure exactly, but it had the libretto on it in German in one column and right next to it in English. So you don't just turn on the record player, or in this case the CD or MP3 player, and just listen to it. You've got to understand it's a play. So you look at the words as you're listening to the music, and you understand what's happening, and you do that a few times, and you follow it all the way through, and it's a great story. It's a fantastic story. Then when you go to the cinema, now of course you've got the surtitle, so you can actually see what people are singing too, which helps. But it's vital to understand that Wagner's dramas are stories, and that you have to know what people are saying. Yes, they are very long. There's no question about it. The Ring, for example, typically is produced in the course of a week. On Monday, you get the first one, Das Rheingold, which is a pretty average opera length, actually. It's probably no longer than 3 hours. On Tuesday, you get Die Walküre, which is quite a bit longer. Wednesday, you get off. Thursday, you get the third one, Siegfried. Friday you get off, and then on Saturday you get the longest of them all, which is Goethe Dämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, and you probably go into about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You go into it and emerge about 11. The first act of Goethe Dämmerung, it's in 3 acts, is longer than the whole of Tosca. So that's
very interesting fact. Actually, I hadn't realised that, but certainly that gives you a sense of how
the scale of it.
The scale of it, exactly.
And,
yes.
Of course, it's not to everybody's taste. And yet, this year of years, it has been produced in just about every major city in the world. More books have been written about Wagner. I have been reliably informed, and have been written about Napoleon, for example, or Shakespeare. More books have been written about the works of Shakespeare than on but these are books on Wagner himself as well as on the works of Wagner. This year alone, scores of books have been written about him. And his art, like all great art, is susceptible to extraordinary amounts of interpretation. He was first thought of as a left-wing composer, a socialist composer, and the great apologist for Wagner in 19th and early 20th century Britain was George Bernard Shaw, that great socialist Fabian. And he saw the Ring as a sort of allegory of capital and labour, that the Nibelungen hammering away at the mountain with the were the workers, and the gods were the fat, bloated capitalists. Others, the horrific Stuart Chamberlain, who married into the Wagner family, who was a total fascist and who was the one who encouraged the young Hitler when he was starting his political career to come to Bayreuth, was convinced that the villains in Wagner's works were the Jews, and that therefore the Albrecht and Mime, who are the Nibelungen, are Jews, and in that period were portrayed as such. there's no direct reference anywhere by Wagner that they should be so. Wagner wrote a really most unpleasant work called On Jewishness and Music, in which he laid into the two very successful Jewish composers, Meyerbeer, who's now not nearly as successful or as well or often performed, although he was once this year at the Royal Opera House, but at the time was the most successful opera composer in the world, and Mendelssohn, both of whom were Jewish, and he was just absolutely laid into them. Nowadays it's considered that he laid into Jewishness almost in order to define Germanness. He needed to find what wasn't German to find out what was, because he did write many articles called What is to be German, because Germany is still not a country. And of course, for all his red left tendencies and his desire to build a state of Germanic people, he could not have been more delighted when he was absolutely on his final beam ends, owed money to everybody, and was about to be arrested when promptly the King of Bavaria died and his son Ludwig
he was a great champion, wasn't he?
Yes, and had worshipped Wagner for
Yes.
years and built fantasy castles devoted, particularly, of course, Neuschwanstein, which is devoted to himself as the Swan King, and it's as in Lohengrin. And he gave Wagner just about everything he wanted, including enough money to build his theatre, enough time to paid off his debts. I mean, it was an extraordinary act of good fortune, and it resulted in Bayreuth being built, and in his own lifetime, the first production of The Ring, to which came every emperor, Tchaikovsky came, Grieg came, Brahms, all the great composers of the day attended. Even Karl Marx attempted to get there, but was stopped by a mixture of having appalling hemorrhoids. Not being able to find anywhere to stay within miles of Bayreuth because all the inns were taken in. But it was one of the great cultural events of its time. Naturally, a lot of people, as is the case with modern art, thought that it was very pretentious. A lot of people loathed Wagner and all he stood for, not because of anything political, but because of it. They thought it was just pretension. They're the I go to the theatre to be entertained kind of people. Well, I don't go to the theatre to be entertained. I go to be enthralled, enchanted, beguiled, surprised, horrified. Have my point of view, taken and reversed. I don't go just to be entertained.
Yes.